He wasn't a rebel. He wasn't a politician. He was just a farmer who'd lost everything, his land, his hope, and his faith in the people who promised to help. But when he refused to shake the president's hand, something happened that no one expected, especially the First Lady. The crowd went silent, the farmer who refused to shake Trump's hand. The crowd went silent. Cameras clicked. You could almost hear the wind blowing through the American flags lined up behind the stage. Every eye was locked on one man, a farmer in a worn, dusty brown jacket, his boots caked with the mud of a lifetime's work. President Donald Trump stood just a few feet away, smiling, his hand extended in a gesture meant to symbolize unity, a bridge between Washington and America's hardworking farmers. But the man didn't move. He stood firm, shoulders squared, eyes fixed forward. He didn't take the president's hand. At first, people thought maybe he didn't see it. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But then a few seconds passed, and it became clear, he wasn't moving by choice. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Secret Service agents subtly shifted their stance, hands ready at their sides. The reporters in the front row leaned forward, camera shutters firing like machine guns. "What's going on?" someone whispered. It was supposed to be a picture-perfect moment, the president honoring the backbone of America, the farmers who kept food on the nation's tables. The event had been promoted for weeks as a celebration of new policies designed to lift rural America. There were banners that read, "Stronger Together, Farmers First." There was music, applause, even tears from a few proud families watching from the crowd. But all of that stopped the moment this one man refused to play along. The farmer's name was Tom Bennett, 54 years old, from a small town just outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa. A man who had spent his entire life working the same soil his father and grandfather had once tilled. To most people, Tom looked like any ordinary farmer. Weathered face, sunburnt neck, the kind of man who measured time not in years but in harvests. But inside, Tom was a storm of emotions, frustration, exhaustion, and a deep sense of betrayal. As the president stood before him, Tom wasn't seeing a politician. He was seeing the years of pain his community had endured, the sleepless nights, the failed crops, the debt piling higher than the grain silos on his land. He remembered the floods that had swept through Iowa 2 years earlier, water rushing through his fields like a river, destroying almost everything he'd planted. He remembered standing knee-deep in mud, trying to save what he could, only to realize he couldn't save much at all. He remembered the letter from the bank, cold, final words threatening foreclosure if he couldn't make the next payment. And he remembered the promises. Promises from leaders who said help was coming. Promises that never arrived. Tom had applied for government aid, the financial relief that was supposed to help farmers like him recover. But month after month, the checks never came. He called, he waited, he hoped. But each time, the answer was the same: your application is still being processed. He felt invisible. Forgotten. And now, here was the president, smiling, shaking hands, claiming victory for helping farmers. To the cameras, it looked like progress. But to Tom, it felt like a lie. As the president reached out to him, Tom's heart pounded. He knew everyone was watching, his neighbors, his friends, maybe even his kids back home. He thought about his wife, Mary, who had cried at the kitchen table the night before, wondering how they would pay the bills. He thought about his father, who always said, "A man's handshake is his word." But what did a handshake mean when you didn't believe the words behind it? So he did the only thing his conscience would let him do. He stood still. For a few long seconds, no one breathed. Trump's hand lingered in the air before he slowly lowered it, his expression tightening just slightly, not anger, but confusion. The crowd didn't know what to do. Some people clapped awkwardly, others whispered. A few even booed. But Tom didn't flinch. He didn't shout or raise his voice. He simply stood his ground, eyes steady, every line in his face telling the story of a man who'd been pushed to his limit. In that silent standoff, something powerful happened. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't politics. It was the raw, human moment when one man's pain collided with the world's attention. And though it lasted less than 10 seconds, it would become one of the most talked about moments of the year. By that evening, clips of the encounter flooded social media. News anchors debated it. Headlines read: Iowa farmer refuses to shake president's hand, but why? But what no one realized yet, not the reporters, not the crowd, not even the president, was that this simple refusal wasn't the end of the story. For Tom Bennett, it was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would test his beliefs, his pride, and his heart in ways he never expected. Tom's story, the farmer who lost almost everything. Tom wasn't trying to make a scene. He wasn't some activist looking for attention. He was just a man, a hard-working, honest man, who had lost almost everything he'd ever worked for. For as long as he could remember, farming was his life. He didn't just grow crops, he grew hope. Every seed he planted carried the dreams of his father, his grandfather, and every Bennett who had worked that same stretch of Iowa soil before him. But the last few years had been brutal, the kind of years that test a man's faith. It started with the floods. The rain came harder than anyone could remember. Weeks of storms turned the fields into lakes. Tom stood at the edge of his land, helpless, watching the water rise higher each day. His crops, his entire year's work, disappeared beneath a sheet of brown, rushing water. When the storm finally passed, he walked out into the soggy mess that used to be his soybean field. The smell of rot filled the air. Stalks lay broken and twisted. Months of effort gone overnight. Still, he refused to give up. That's not what Bennett's did. He borrowed money, repaired what he could, and started again. But then came the next blow. His tractor, the one he'd bought secondhand, broke down right in the middle of harvest season. The repairs cost more than he could afford. Then another piece of equipment failed. One by one, his tools gave out, and each time he fixed one problem, two more seemed to appear. He sold old parts, dipped into his savings, even took a small loan against his home. Anything to keep the farm running. But the numbers never added up. And just when he thought things couldn't get worse, tariffs hit. Prices for his soybeans collapsed almost overnight. What little he could sell barely covered the cost of fuel to transport them. Tom watched the market reports on his old radio every morning, hoping for some good news. It never came. He had always been proud of his independence, the kind of man who never asked for help. But eventually, he had no choice. He filled out the government forms, explaining how the floods and tariffs had nearly ruined him. He submitted every document, every photo, every proof of loss. Then he waited. And waited. Weeks turned into months, and the mailbox stayed empty. No check. No letter. No help. He called the office handling relief funds again and again, only to hear the same scripted responses: "Your case is being reviewed, sir. We understand your frustration, but these things take time." Meanwhile, time was exactly what he was running out of. He fell behind on payments. The bank called, then called again. Finally, the letter came. Cold and final. He had to sell part of his land. It broke him. That land wasn't just dirt to Tom. It was history, his father's sweat, his mother's prayers, his childhood memories. Selling even a piece of it felt like tearing away part of his soul. When the auction ended, and a stranger drove away with the deed, Tom sat in his pickup truck for nearly an hour, staring out at what used to be his field. He didn't cry, not because he didn't want to, but because he was too tired to. He told his wife, Mary, he was done. "Maybe it's time to let go," he said quietly. "Maybe this is the end of the line." Mary refused to believe that. She was his rock, the kind of woman who saw light even when the night was pitch black. She put her hand on his and said, "You can't stop fighting now, Tom. Not when it matters most." A few weeks later, a letter arrived, an official invitation to a government event. The president was visiting Iowa to announce new programs for farmers. Tom laughed when he read it. "What's the point?" he said bitterly. "They don't care about people like us. They care about the cameras." But Mary didn't let it go. "Then go," she said. "Let them see you. Let them hear your story. Someone has to speak up for the ones who can't." He didn't want to. He was tired of speeches and promises. But something about her words stuck with him. Maybe she was right. Maybe showing up was his last chance to be heard. So on the morning of the event, he put on his cleanest shirt, one with only a few stains he couldn't scrub out, and his old brown jacket. The one his father used to wear. He got in his truck before dawn and drove for hours through the misty Iowa roads. When he arrived, the place was already packed. Flags waved, people cheered, reporters shouted questions. Tom felt out of place among the suits and polished shoes, but he took his spot in the front row, silent, waiting. As the speeches went on, he listened carefully. Promises, applause, more promises. Then came the moment that would change everything. The president stepped down from the podium and walked straight toward Tom, smiling, hand extended. And that's when Tom realized, this was the man he blamed for his family's pain. The man whose policies had broken him. And in that instant, with the cameras flashing and the world watching, Tom had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be, one who stayed silent, or one who finally stood up. The refusal that went viral, and the woman who noticed. When Tom Bennett refused to shake President Trump's hand, it lasted only a few seconds, but in those few seconds, everything changed. It was such a small gesture, or rather, the absence of one, but it carried the weight of years of struggle, frustration, and pain. Cameras caught it from every angle, the president's extended hand, the farmer standing still, the brief flicker of confusion on Trump's face before he turned to greet someone else. To anyone in the crowd, it seemed like an awkward moment, gone as quickly as it came. But to the thousands watching at home, replaying the clip again and again, it became something much bigger. By that evening, the video was everywhere. On Facebook, on Twitter, on every major news channel. Within hours, hashtags began trending. Hashtag the farmer who stood still. Hashtag handshake refusal. Hashtag Tom Bennett speaks for us. Some people hailed Tom as a hero, a man brave enough to stand up to power. They said he represented the forgotten worker, the man who'd been ignored for too long. Others accused him of being disrespectful, ungrateful, even un-American. But Tom didn't care about the noise. He didn't do it to go viral. He didn't do it to make headlines. He did it because in that moment, his heart wouldn't let him do anything else. After the event, Tom left quietly. He didn't talk to the reporters shouting his name. He didn't post a video or write a statement. He just walked back to his truck, climbed in, and drove home down the long, empty Iowa roads. He turned off the radio halfway through the drive. He didn't want to hear people arguing about what he did or why. To him, it was simple. He stood for what he believed in. When he got home, his wife Mary was waiting at the kitchen table. She looked up at him, her eyes worried. "I saw it," she said softly. Tom nodded, setting down his hat. "It wasn't planned," he said. "I just couldn't do it." She smiled faintly. "I know." They didn't talk much after that. Tom went out to the porch, sat down, and stared at the fading light over his fields. He thought maybe that was the end of it, a small act, already being swallowed by the next day's news cycle. But it wasn't the end. Because somewhere else that night, someone else was thinking about that same moment, someone who saw more than defiance in the farmer's eyes. Someone who saw pain. That person was First Lady Melania Trump. She had been standing just a few steps behind her husband during the event. She had seen the exchange, the hesitation, the quiet sadness in the farmer's face, the way he looked not angry, but deeply disappointed. Later that evening, as the president prepared to leave Iowa, Melania sat in a quiet room, away from the noise of reporters and staff. She couldn't get that man's face out of her mind. She turned to one of her aides. "Who was that man in the brown jacket?" she asked. The aide looked confused. "You mean the farmer who didn't shake the president's hand?" Melania nodded slowly. "Yes. Him. Find out his name." An hour later, they returned with a folder, photos, event records, and a short background summary. His name was Tom Bennett, a soybean farmer from Cedar Rapids. The aide explained what they had found: the floods, the debt, the land he had lost, the aid that never came. Melania sat silently for a moment, reading every line carefully. She closed the folder, exhaled, and said something that surprised everyone in the room. "I want to meet him," she said simply. The aide hesitated. "Ma'am, that might not be." But she interrupted gently. "Before we leave this state," she said, "I want to meet that man." There was something in her voice, quiet but firm. It wasn't about politics or publicity. It was personal. That night, while most of the staff prepared for departure, Melania made her own plans. No press. No cameras. Just a visit. When she informed the president, he raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" he asked. Melania nodded. "Sometimes people just need to be heard," she said softly. And so, as the world argued online about whether Tom was a hero or a fool, the First Lady's convoy quietly charted a new route, one that led straight to a small farmhouse at the edge of a field in Iowa. Inside that farmhouse, Tom had no idea what was coming. He thought the world would move on by morning. But destiny had other plans. Because the woman who noticed his silence, the one person who saw beyond the headlines, was already on her way to meet him face to face. And that meeting would change everything. Melania's unexpected visit, the conversation that changed everything. The next morning began like any other. The sun was just starting to rise over the Bennett farm, spilling soft gold light across the dew-covered fields. Inside the kitchen, Tom and Mary sat across from each other, the quiet hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence. Mary poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. Tom was staring out the window, lost in thought. He hadn't slept much. The events of the day before, the handshake refusal, the cameras, the attention, played over and over in his mind. "I shouldn't have gone," he muttered finally. "It won't change anything." Mary reached over and touched his hand. "Maybe it already has," she said softly. Before Tom could answer, they both heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel. At first, he thought it was the mail truck or maybe a neighbor dropping by. But the sound didn't stop. More engines followed. Tom frowned. "Who on earth is that at this hour?" he said, pushing his chair back. He stepped out onto the porch, shielding his eyes from the morning sun. What he saw made him freeze. A line of dark SUVs had pulled into his driveway, their black paint gleaming in the light. For a moment, he thought something was wrong, maybe reporters had tracked him down. But then the car doors opened, and out stepped someone he never imagined he'd see on his dirt road. It was the First Lady of the United States, Melania Trump. No flashing cameras. No crowd. Just her, a few aides, and a small group of Secret Service agents standing respectfully near the vehicles. Tom's heart skipped a beat. What in the world?" he whispered. Melania walked toward him with calm grace, her expression kind but serious. "Mr. Bennett," she said softly, extending her hand. "I believe we have something to talk about." Tom blinked, momentarily speechless. He managed to nod and shake her hand, the irony not lost on him. "Ma'am," he said, clearing his throat, I wasn't expecting visitors." She smiled gently. "I imagine you weren't." Mary appeared at the door, eyes wide in disbelief. Melania turned to her and said warmly, "You must be Mrs. Bennett. Thank you for having us." Within minutes, they were all seated at the Bennett's old wooden kitchen table. The same table where Tom had once cried over bills and lost harvests now hosted the First Lady of the United States. But there was no formality, no stiff speeches. Melania didn't come with reporters or microphones. She came with a notebook and a simple request. "Tell me your story," she said. "From the beginning." And so, Tom did. For more than an hour, he spoke. He talked about the storms that destroyed his fields, the years of hard work washed away in a single week. He told her about the tractors that broke down, the loans that buried him deeper in debt, and the letter that forced him to sell part of his family land. His voice trembled when he mentioned his father, how proud he had been of that land, and how ashamed Tom felt to lose it. Melania listened quietly the entire time. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush him. Every now and then, she jotted down a few notes, her eyes soft but intent. When Tom's voice cracked, she waited patiently until he could continue. When he finished, the room was silent. Even the Secret Service agents by the door seemed to stand a little stiller. Melania set her notebook down and looked at Tom with genuine compassion. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "I can't change what happened to your farm. But I can make sure your story doesn't disappear into paperwork." Her words caught him off guard. He had expected polite sympathy, not action. A few minutes later, as they stood outside, she turned to him again. "You stood your ground yesterday," she said. "That took courage." "Not anger, courage." Tom didn't know what to say. For the first time in months, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Before leaving, Melania asked to see his fields. They walked together to the edge of the property. She stopped by the broken fence, gazed across the land, and said quietly, "This country is built by hands like yours. It shouldn't forget that." Then, just as quietly as she had arrived, she left. No speeches. No headlines. Just a promise. Within a week, federal officials arrived in Tom's county. They reviewed his case, spoke with local administrators, and uncovered the delays that had kept his relief funds from reaching him. And then, one morning, Tom opened his mailbox and found the envelope he'd stopped hoping for months ago. The government check had finally arrived. But more than the money, what stayed with him was her parting message. Before she stepped back into her SUV that morning, Melania had turned to him, looked him directly in the eye, and said, "Sometimes it takes courage not to shake a hand, and even more courage to forgive afterward." Tom never forgot those words. They weren't just about politics, they were about grace, humanity, and understanding. And as the sound of the engines faded into the distance, Tom realized something powerful: sometimes the smallest acts of empathy can heal the deepest wounds. The lesson that moved millions, the farmer, the First Lady, and the power of understanding. When the story of Melania Trump's quiet visit to the Bennett farm finally came out, it spread like wildfire across the nation. It wasn't leaked by reporters or shouted from podiums. It started with a single photo, a grainy shot taken by a local who happened to see the First Lady's convoy parked along a country road. Soon after, the details began to unfold: the private meeting, the listening, the promise kept. For once, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about red or blue, right or left. It was about compassion, about one human being seeing another not as an opponent, but as a person. News outlets picked up the story. Headlines read: Melania Trump makes secret visit to Iowa farmer. The handshake refusal that led to healing. A conversation that changed everything. The public couldn't get enough of it. In a world so often divided, this story felt different. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, simple, and deeply human. People admired Tom's honesty, his raw courage to stand up, even when it meant standing alone. And they admired Melania's humanity, her willingness to step away from the spotlight and simply listen. Tom received letters from strangers all over the country. Some came from fellow farmers who said, "You spoke for all of us." Others came from people in cities who wrote, "You reminded us what integrity looks like." But Tom didn't see himself as a hero. In fact, he was almost embarrassed by the attention. When reporters asked him to describe what happened that morning, he kept it simple. "I didn't refuse the handshake because I hate anyone," he said during one interview. "I did it because I was hurting. Because I felt forgotten. But Mrs. Trump reminded me that someone was listening, and sometimes, that's all we really need." His words struck a chord with millions. "I realized," he continued, "that real change doesn't always come from shouting. Sometimes it starts with listening, and caring enough to understand." The clip of that interview went viral. Teachers played it in classrooms. Pastors mentioned it in Sunday sermons. It became more than a political story, it became a lesson in humility, forgiveness, and unity. Meanwhile, life on the Bennett farm slowly began to turn around. The government aid helped them rebuild the parts of the property that had been lost. New seeds were planted, new fences built, and hope began to return to the soil. Tom spent more time on the fields again, not with bitterness in his heart, but with gratitude. He worked side by side with Mary, just as they had in the early days of their marriage. Each sunrise felt like a second chance. Months passed. The crops grew taller and greener than they had in years. And when harvest season came, Tom felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table eating dinner, Mary placed a small wooden plaque on the wall. It was simple, carved by hand, the letters slightly uneven, but the message was powerful. It read, "Respect doesn't always start with agreement, but with understanding." Tom looked at it for a long time, his eyes glistening. "That's perfect," he said softly. That plaque became more than decoration. It became a reminder of everything they had learned, that disagreement didn't have to mean division, and that listening could heal wounds words never could. Tom still doesn't call himself a political man. He doesn't campaign, doesn't go on talk shows, and doesn't seek attention. But when people ask him about that day, the day he refused the president's handshake, he always smiles and says the same thing. "I didn't shake the president's hand," he tells them, "but I learned something even more powerful." He pauses every time before finishing the sentence, because it still hits him deep. When people see each other as human, not as sides, not as enemies, miracles can happen. Those words became the heart of his story. And though the world kept spinning, though new headlines replaced old ones, Tom's story lingered, a gentle reminder that kindness can come from unexpected places. Sometimes, it takes standing firm to be heard. Other times, it takes listening to truly understand. And every now and then, it takes both. In the months that followed, Tom and Mary often watched the sunset from their porch. The fields glowed gold in the fading light, and the hum of crickets filled the air. Tom would sip his coffee and glance at Mary with a small smile. "You know," he'd say, "if I'd shaken his hand that day, none of this might have happened." Mary would laugh softly. "Maybe," she'd say. "But maybe you were meant to teach people something instead." Tom looked out at his land, the land he nearly lost, the land that now stood strong again, and nodded. "Maybe we both were," he said. And as the last rays of sunlight stretched across the Iowa sky, Tom Bennett, the farmer who once stood still in front of the president, finally felt what he'd been searching for all along. Peace. Tom's story reminds us that sometimes the smallest act of compassion can change a life, and maybe even heal a nation. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful true stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and remember, every act of kindness matters.